Good evening, and welcome to a panel discussion on Is Justice Blind? Racism in Oregon's Criminal Justice System. Evidence suggests that at each step in our criminal justice system, police stops, arrests, charging, convictions, incarceration, etc., people of color are more likely to have a negative outcome than similarly situated whites. Tonight, we will explore why people of color are overrepresented in Oregon's criminal justice system, the impacts on our community, some recent advances, and where we should go from here. My name is JoAnn Hardesty, and I'm the president of the Portland branch of the NAACP, and I will be moderating this evening's panel. This forum is sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Portland and the Portland chapter of the Links Incorporated. The program will be taped by Metro East Community Media for rebroadcasting and will be available for online viewing at the League of Women Voters of Portland's website, www.lwvpdx.org, soon afterwards. The program is supported by a grant from the Multnomah Bar Foundation. We are fortunate to have 4 panelists, and I just happen to be one of those, but I'll tell you about that later. We are fortunate to have 4 panelists who are experts on Oregon's criminal justice system and will bring their unique and important perspectives to the discussion. David Rogers, ACLU of Oregon's Executive Director, will discuss the criminal justice system as a driver of inequality and explain how it affects an individual's major life activities, such as employment, housing, family success, wealth creation, health, and participation in the democratic process. Andy Coe, Executive Director of Partnership for Safety and Justice, will discuss how national and Oregon drug war policies and sentencing practices have disproportionately impacted communities of color. Katie Sawicki, Policy Director of the Urban League of Portland, will discuss the State of Black Oregon's 2015 report, findings that apply to African Americans in Oregon criminal justice system. And so it is my pleasure now to begin the conversation with the question, is justice blind? Racism in the criminal justice system. Our first speaker is David Rogers, who became the Executive Director of the ACLU of Oregon on June 1st, 2015. David has more than 25 years of social justice organizing, advocacy, and organizational development experience, and the last 15 years have been rooted in Oregon. As the former Executive Director of Partnership for Safety and Justice, he spent nearly a decade leading groundbreaking work in the area of criminal justice and public safety. This past year, he consulted with national foundations to identify promising approaches to dismantle the policies and impacts of mass incarceration and criminalization. David has a proven track record in grassroots leadership development, organizing, public education, and communications, and legislative advocacy. We are honored to have David Rogers discuss the criminal justice impact on individuals and the community. David, take it away.
Thanks, JoAnn. So it's really, really good to be here. Thank you for this opportunity. And it's interesting, I hadn't actually thought about the question, the title of the forum, is justice blind, until I just heard JoAnn mention it. And I really don't have to hesitate to answer the question. I think not only is justice not blind, justice is actually brutal in this country, and I'll talk more about that. So I'm going to try and provide a quick overview of the dramatic growth of the criminal justice system in the US over the past 30 years, and also to talk about the implications of the growth. I want to talk briefly about how mass criminalization is a core driver of inequality in the US. In fact, I actually think it's the most serious driver of inequality in this country. And infused into the slides that I'm going to present will be a snapshot of the ways people of color in particular, fare much, much worse in terms of the impacts of the criminal justice system in this country. And to be clear, this is going to be a quick presentation. The slides are limited. It's not a comprehensive overview. I'm going to try and move through things fairly quickly. So in that respect, I would say fasten your seatbelts, because this is going to be a wild and sadly depressing ride. But, you know, and I won't make any promises, but my sense is that we will actually get around to talking about solutions and provide you all with some level of optimism that this really dire situation can change. So with that, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So the remote is in fact working. So this first slide shows the growth of the prison population in the US, both federal and state prisons, from 1925 to 2012. So as you can see, the rise in incarceration in the US is a relatively recent dynamic. So starting around 1980, the use of incarceration has skyrocketed. So although we have just 5% of the world's population, we have in the US over 25% of the world's prison population. This slide is helpful in recognizing that the dynamic that we've been experiencing is not just a rise of mass incarceration, which is a term you hear a lot these days. Actually, the US has been experiencing not only just the skyrocketing growth of the use of prisons, but really the skyrocketing growth of the use of corrections in the criminal justice system altogether. So what this chart shows is that here we see not only a rise in the number of people in prison and jails, but also the number of people on parole and on probation. So currently in the US, roughly 1 out of every 100 adults, US adults, is incarcerated. Yet, in the US currently, about 1 in every 31 adults is under some form of correctional control. So either prison or jail or on probation or parole. It's a pretty severe problem. And to be clear, the dynamic is even more overreaching than this. So, although a lot of people around the country are talking about mass incarceration, I actually think that mass incarceration is the product of a larger trend, which is mass criminalization. And so when we look at this chart, that yellow circle represents the number of people currently in a prison or jail, state or federal, in the US. That green circle envelops the yellow circle, represents the number of people under some form of correctional control. So prison, jail, parole, probation. That blue circle, that giant blue circle, is actually the number of people in the US with some level of criminal conviction, right? So really what we see is the dynamic in the US is that we've fallen in love with criminalizing, making everything a crime, and actually, you know, convicting people for a living, really. But not everyone, targeted communities. So just to say a little bit more about this dynamic, I think that the reason why people are often focused on mass incarceration rather than this larger trend of mass criminalization is that the harshest outcomes of mass criminalization are actually about locking people up, because that's about separating people from their loved ones, their families and their children and their community, exposing people to the institutional violence that happens in prison and jail, and also creating the massive gaps in access to income, access to employment and educational opportunities. And then the other reason why I think that people are focused on mass incarceration rather than this larger trend, mass incarceration rather than mass criminalization, is because of the economic impact of building and filling prisons. It is so expensive that it has had a huge impact on state budgets, which I will talk a little bit more about, and has had a profound impact on under-resourcing communities, particularly communities of color. So I don't want to discourage people from focusing on mass incarceration, because I'm going to actually do that myself in a bit. But I did want to note that I think that there's a larger trend here happening around mass criminalization. So that said, to be clear, is this the right slide? Actually, I'm going to skip it. All right. So to be clear, racial disparities in the numbers in terms of who's impacted are severe. 60% of the people in prison are people of color, and the numbers hit Black communities particularly hard. I also want to note, actually, before moving on, though, that gathering data on Asian and Native American populations is actually really difficult. And I don't want to go through this in a way that completely invisibilizes those communities, but I want to acknowledge that, for the most part, finding data in terms of comparing how communities are impacted, you're really limited to comparing white communities and Black communities and Latino communities. And so I want to note that this is a problem and it needs to be addressed. And it's not so much my problem as a presenter, but more as a problem of the lack of data. Having said that, just pushing on with a focus on racial disparity, another way to look at racial disparity is to examine the likelihood that certain populations will be incarcerated in their lifetime based on the current trajectory of the disparity in the numbers. And although the data up here is a bit old, I want to say that not really much has changed. So this is a very reasonable snapshot of how the future of different groups is being impacted right now by mass incarceration. So if you're a Black man, you have a 1 in 3 chance of being incarcerated in your lifetime. If you're a Latino, you have a 1 in 6 chance of being incarcerated in your lifetime, compared to if you're a white man, you have a 1 in 17 chance. So if you're a Black woman, you have a 1 in 18 chance of being incarcerated, compared to if you're a Latina, a 1 in 45 chance of being incarcerated in your lifetime. If you're a white woman, a 1 in 110, 111 chance of being incarcerated. When it comes to racial disparity, these are really gloomy numbers. And I gotta say that the racial disparity becomes much more disheartening when we look at the collateral consequences of the criminal justice system in terms of involvement and how that impacts individuals, families, and communities. And I'm about to go there. And I'm really not trying to depress everyone. But this is about being real. So before I jump into looking at the collateral consequences, I just want to say that I want you to keep this frame in mind. I believe that when you look at the collateral consequences of mass criminalization, you can easily argue that our criminal justice system and the policies and practices are the biggest driver of inequality in this country right now. So this is the place where I'm going to start to move fairly quickly. I'm not going to actually talk about what's on every slide. So sorry, that's the way it is. I want to make sure that we have room to engage one another after our presentations. So first of all, incarceration severely limits economic prospects for people. Formerly incarcerated people earn significantly less over their lifetimes, roughly 40% less than their counterparts who have never been incarcerated. And here again, outcomes are much worse for people of color. So one of the reasons for reduced economic prospects are the barriers to getting a job. First of all, I want to remember that giant blue circle that represented everyone who has a criminal conviction in this country. The National Employment Law Project estimates that over 65 million people in the US have a criminal record, which is a mind-boggling number, right? And it just speaks to the extreme growth of the criminal justice system over the past 30 years. So of course, when you have a conviction history, it's much harder to access education, housing, services, employment, among a range of things, because you have to fill out an application, whether it's a scholarship application, a housing application, a job application, that always fundamentally asks the question, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And, you know, up here we see that 92% of all employers are asking that question. But the problem is not always just asking the question, is that the employers are now not making individual determinations around whether or not someone's conviction history is actually at all relevant to whether or not they should be employed in that job. And so they're really screening out people in indiscriminate, wholesale ways. So it leaves people asking that question, right? When do I ever get a second chance? People who are doing the hard work of trying to rebuild their lives are essentially facing barriers at every step of the way. And here again, when we're looking at job possibilities, we see significant racial disparity. This study in particular shows that Black people with comparative resumes got fewer callbacks after job interviews than white people with no conviction histories at all. So, you know, apparently in this country, we don't seem particularly concerned about trying to help people rebuild their lives. So the profound barriers and harsh collateral consequences are not limited to just system-involved people, but they extend well beyond to people's families and their children. So almost 3 million children have a parent behind bars at this point in the US. And that number, as you can see, has dramatically risen. So, you know, it's no surprise as well that there's significant racial disparity here. So 1 in 9 Black children have an incarcerated parent compared to 1 in 57 children who are white. And we know that children with an incarcerated parent are actually much less likely to finish secondary school, and they're gonna have significantly less chances of upward economic mobility. So we're talking about a situation that's developing an intense intergenerational cycle of poverty, criminal justice involvement, and inequality. So far, I've been focusing on how mass criminalization impacts individuals and families. But mass criminalization and incarceration has a very macro impact on really driving the conditions of inequality for entire communities. And so one of the primary reasons for that is that incarceration is the most expensive approach to addressing crime. So the rise in its use has come at a very, very serious cost. In fact, Department of Corrections budgets are the fastest growing portions of state budgets around the country, and that's been the case for quite some time. So this dynamic has created a macro level, what I would call an under-resourcing of the kinds of programs and services that are actually best equipped to build safe, healthy, and thriving communities. So essentially, as we spend more money building and filling prisons, which again is the most expensive and the least effective way to address crime, we see more and more of our tax dollars building and filling prisons, and so they're not available to spend on things like education, drug treatment, mental health services, economic development, the kinds of things that help break the cycle. So we are really doing a profound job in terms of just holding entire communities back, keeping also the racial disparity in mind. And so a quick comparison between corrections spending and spending on higher education in the US from 1987 to 2007 helps make that point of where the money's going and where it's not going. So I'm just about wrapping up here with this sad tale. So as if the impacts of mass criminalization couldn't get any worse in terms of driving inequality, I mentioned how conviction histories make it harder to gain access to housing, education, jobs, services, economic mobility. Well, guess what? mass incarceration and criminalization is also a fundamental driver of political inequality. Felony disenfranchisement laws around the country, which essentially are designed to prevent people with felony convictions from voting and exercising their right to vote, which, by the way, felony disenfranchisement laws, in my mind, really are the mother of all voter suppression efforts in the country, outside of outright lynching and acts of violence targeting people of color. The Sentencing Project estimates that nearly 6 million people have been disenfranchised in the US because of these laws. And when you're looking at the black population in particular, 1 in every 13 African Americans have no longer have the right to vote because of these disenfranchisement laws. I've been providing the kind of global perspective, and my colleagues up here will, in addition, will help kind of describe what's happening here in Oregon. I will say that we are lucky that here in Oregon, when it comes to disenfranchisement laws, we actually have some of the better laws in the country. And so even if you have a felony conviction, as long as you're not in prison and you're not in jail, if you're in the community, you have the right to vote. So Oregon gets it right. The only problem is, because these laws are so pervasive around the country, so many people don't know that they have the right, and so that they're not exercising it, because they assume that Oregon is not one of those states that's getting it right. So I'll just say that maybe it's time to just take a deep breath. This stuff is really heavy when you think about actually the impact it has on people, families, communities. And I think that by the end of this, all of our presentations and our conversation, we will actually demonstrate that there are reasons to be optimistic that we can change things. That said, clearly the situation is so severe that change will not be easy, and it will be a long time to really chip away and make things. I don't even know if we can make things right, but perhaps we can make things significantly better.
Thank you, David. We certainly appreciate that detailed background. I want to let the audience know that you have note cards available to you, so as speakers are talking and questions come to your mind, there are volunteers walking around with note cards that are available for you to write your questions down. We're going to move right into our next speaker, who is Andy Coe. Andy is Executive Director of Partnership for Safety and Justice. He was raised in the Northeast. Andy has spent half of his professional life in the Pacific Northwest as an attorney by training. The first decade of his career involved litigating homeless prevention cases in New York City, economic opportunity, health, and education. Oh, actually, that's not the right page, is it? I'm sorry about that.
It's really not that interesting, actually.
No, I think it was absolutely wonderfully interesting. I think it is my pleasure to introduce Andy Coe. So, Andy, take it away.
Thank you. Maybe the one thing that's interesting and appropriate is I did a lot of drug policy work in a prior life. So I'm going to go a little bit off script, which I hope I don't screw up because my friend Leanne decided to show up without telling me. So David covered a lot of the national statistics and sort of the global framework of all of this, right? I'm going to rattle off a few Oregon statistics. And these were generated for us by the Urban Institute. Shannon White, who a number of you probably know, who's the deputy director, she and I went to a national convening put on by the Public Welfare Foundation, and the Urban Institute was generating these stats for us. So one is, and this has to do with one of the collateral harms of mass criminalization in this country for Oregon. Oregon is number 2 in terms of the percentage of its general fund that goes to corrections. So 13.5% of this state's money goes into locking up its citizens, basically. And this is This is only behind Michigan and just ahead of Arizona. Another interesting stat, in Oregon, a black is 6 times more likely to be in prison than a white. So we have, per 100,000, we have 1,979 African-American inmates. We have 356 per 100,000. Pretty stark. Crime trends in Oregon are basically like the rest of the country. So for instance, I don't even know over what period. This is between 2003 and 2013. Violent crimes have gone down by 18%, even though our prison population has increased quite a bit. And property crimes have gone down by 33%. So as the crime rate is falling, the prison population is increasing. Go figure. And one of the reasons why I'm putting these out in a forum about racism in the criminal justice system, and I think that's a really complex statement, right? There's a lot that goes into that statement, is that I actually really believe, and this is sort of a statement for myself, is that I think when you give the state so much power, this is like the ultimate power, at least outside of the military, this is the ultimate power for government, is to take its own citizens and others, not just its own citizens, and lock them up. And then impose, as David was describing, collateral harms on them that essentially, limit their lives for the rest of their lives. So it's pretty extreme. Oregon drug arrests. So here's an interesting thing about Oregon, and this is one of the things that we have to deal with in terms of mass criminalization. 70% of the people in prison are in prison for violent crimes. Now the key there is, or the hitch there is that what is a violent crime, right? Whatever you say is a violent crime becomes a violent crime, right? But 70% are violent crimes. So there's a public messaging, there's a political piece to that. Reducing that prison population is going to be tough in this state. But at the same time, while 70% are in prison for violent crimes, we have quite a large number of people who are arrested for drug crimes, nonviolent crimes. So, in the United States, drug arrests have gone down by 17% around the country. In Oregon, they've gone up, and this is from 2004 to 2003, drug arrests have gone up in Oregon by 10%. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the war on drugs very, very quickly. It's interesting that what I was supposed to talk about, how does this happen? Drug wars and youth and adults. It's interesting, in 5 to 10 minutes, how do you describe how something like this happens, right? I just mentioned that. There was one more thing I think I wanted to mention. Here it is, and this is the big one too. So many of you probably know what Measure 11 is. 21 serious crimes. They're serious crimes. It's not that they're not serious crimes, but 21 serious crimes had heaped on them enormous sentences. And on top of that, children, because they are children, teenagers between the ages of 15 and 18, when they are charged with certain crimes, are automatically put into the adult system. There's been a lot of advocacy around making sure that within that system they're as safe as they possibly can be. But the fact of the matter is they've been charged as adults, they're sentenced as adults, and they have a criminal record the rest of their lives. So I just want to jump into going back on script what I was supposed to talk about. So within those Measure 11 crimes, 11% of them are youth. So 11% of Measure 11 charging is of youth. So these are young people who are charged with these adult crimes. And I wanted to tell you a couple more stats about youth. If I can find it. This is interesting too. At least it was interesting to me when I read a report that we're about to put out at Partnership for Safety and Justice. It's coming your way very, very soon. About a quarter of the young people in the state are Black or Latino. About 50%, so twice as many of the young people who are charged with Measure 11 crimes are Black or Latino. So you've got a huge imbalance there between who is actually being charged. On top of all that, and this is sort of one of the things in terms of how to address this type of problem, one, you have to have the information, right? We got that number, and this was, I think this work was started actually, you may all know that David was my predecessor in my job, so that's another little bit of pressure here. work that was started when he was there, we actually went in and looked, PSJ went in and looked at the statistics. And the statistics, what they found was that the statistics and the reporting were incomplete. About 25% of the youth across the board, and there's a bunch of different sources of this, but about 25% of the youth, their race or ethnicity was not identified. So PSJ went in and actually tried to fill that gap. When they took that 25%, went through and tried to figure out by comparing different indicators, as well as reporting by various agencies who was being arrested. And again, this is how they came up with half of the youth, half of the teenagers, the older children who are being charged with Measure 11 crimes are actually children. So it's interesting. How does this happen? I think it happens for all the reasons that I think probably all of us can think of. We live in a society that historically has draw lines between people of different races and apply different standards to them, from things as extreme as chattel slavery through Jim Crow up to the present day. But I also think you look at what happens in schools, and in particular with young people. In schools, we have this, and this is something the ACLU. So I actually, spent a lot of my adult life within the ACLU circle, and they do a lot of work around schools and the school-to-prison pipeline and school discipline, and these zero tolerance policies that we've imposed on schools have led to zero tolerance applications of criminal laws to young people as well. And the way they're imposed is incredibly different for young people of color compared to white kids. I mean, it just is. Why does it happen? Again, very, very complex. The next thing I wanted to talk about very briefly is the war on drugs, because that's actually the thing I know most about. And I could talk to you all night about the war on drugs, but I'm going to try to be quick about this. The war on drugs to me is like the perfect vehicle for oppression, right? So you have something that everyone does, that has always been done, that prior to just the last century was never illegal. I mean, there were a few instances in which various rulers outlawed like smoking tobacco, and you could get hung in, I think, Russia for some short period of time by some czar for smoking tobacco. So there's all kinds of things that people have done, but really, the addiction was not criminalized, which essentially we say in legal terms, we say that addiction isn't being criminalized. It's the transport of drugs, it's the possession of drugs. It's a huge fiction. What we're doing is we're criminalizing addiction, really. So we're criminalizing a health condition. So something that everyone does, everyone experiences, that's linked to mental health issues, that's linked to an economy that some people in our society are forced into because of many of the reasons that David gave in terms of the limitations of people's economic opportunities. Something that everyone does, and then you take that, you jack up the sentences, and then you apply it to a certain segment of society. How perfect could that be? And if it's really interesting. I'm going to finish with a little short story, a little anecdote from my early years doing drug policy. It was actually my early week during doing drug policy. I got called to jury duty in my first week of work at the ACLU. I had this big conference happening, I had the speakers coming, and I really did want to get out, but I also sort of wanted to tell the jury and the prosecutor and the defense attorney what I thought. And so at a certain point, I don't know if you've ever been like in a jury pool where at least in Washington, that you have a little card that every time they ask a question, if the answer is yes, you have to hold up your card. And they ask, do you know any of the defense attorneys? Yes. Are any of you attorneys? Yes. And at a certain point, the judge kept on looking at every time a question was asked, juror number 5, is that a yes? So eventually they just started, and they had the jury questionnaire and everything. The prosecutor gets up, and one of the questions had been, do you have an opinion about the war on drugs? And the prosecutor got up and asked me the question, Mr. Coe, juror 5, what is your opinion about the war on drugs? And what I said to the juror and the jury was that I think it's an extension, a historical extension, legacy of slavery in this country. That, we see a progression, and she just stopped me. Thank you, Mr. Coe, or juror number 5, rather. And then she ran back to her chair. And so, of course, she wanted, all the lawyers in the room, of course, what she wanted to do was to be able to not have to use one of her peremptory exclusions on me. She could just, get me off the jury for cause. But, and these friends of mine who are the defense attorneys, they were pissed because they wanted me on the jury, right? As they probably should have, but they were never going to keep me. They still got an acquittal because I hope somebody started thinking about this. It was a black defendant on a residue case, if you know what that is, that's just he had a little bit of like crack in a pipe or something. And they were charging they would have charged him with a huge sentence. And how much more oppressive, how do you define oppression other than that? A man who's addicted to a drug and you're going to send him to prison. Anyways, so war on drugs, it's at least in my mind, it's the vehicle, one of the vehicles. But I think it pervades the whole system.
Thank you so much, Andy, for contributing your valuable insight. Appreciate it. Next, we're going to hear from Katie Sawicki, and she's the Policy Director of the Urban League of Portland. Katie is responsible for advancing the League's social policy agenda to create institutional change in areas that most deeply affect African Americans, communities of colors, and other. She conducts policy research and develops issue campaigns and messaging. To that end, she authored the recently published report on the State of Black Oregon 2015. The report identifies unique challenges and inequalities facing the African American community and poses specific solutions that are oftentimes left out of larger policy discussions on economic opportunity, health, and education. Tonight, she will highlight her findings in the report. Katie, take it away.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Nikengi Harmon-Johnson was originally supposed to be here, and she wanted to send her apologies. She was called to Atlanta for a speaking engagement, so she says hello. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of the criminal justice system on entire Black communities and families. And you may hear a little bit of what David and Andrew both talked about on a national, they kind of spoke from the national level. But I think what's important about repeating some of these things tonight is that a lot of that we found, especially in this report, that these things are true here in Oregon as well. And issues that we need to look at more specifically around how it affects communities on a day-to-day basis, and what that means for the solutions that we create around them. So we want to talk not only about the economic impact on communities, but also the social impact. So the Urban League of Portland released its 2015 State of Black Oregon. This report is published every 5 years. It involves data, research, and case studies and storytelling, and it's meant to serve as a measure of progress or lack thereof in certain social and economic areas. Administration of justice is one of those key areas. So as we dove into the framing of the 2015 report, it became clear that, especially in this report and at this time, we can no longer discuss criminal justice policy in a silo, that if we're truly going to forge an innovative policy path, that we need to take a step back and learn from our partners in direct service, our case managers, our on-the-ground practitioners, people who have known for years what policymakers are starting to catch on to, which is that the most effective solutions exist at the intersection of public service systems. Because we know that a person leaving prison is going to be under community justice, community supervision. We know they're going to need a job. We know they're going to need stable housing. We know they're going to need support for their child who is now dealing with a parent leaving prison and the effects that will have on them in school. So we just named 5 different systems that this person now has to navigate. And also, not only 5 different systems, but also more likely 4 to 5 different offices that they're gonna now have appointments at, that they're gonna now need to get to. And this creates a chaotic environment for that person, but it also, for the purposes of our discussion tonight, creates an opportunity to streamline solutions and provide focused policy solutions at those intersections. So for this reason, we chose to tell the story of Black Oregon in the 2015 report through the lens of child, adult, and community, because ultimately people are not single issue. More importantly, families and communities are tied to multiple systems. And we see this every day at the Urban League. We provide workforce training, job placement, housing, senior services, and sadly, we are hard-pressed to find a single program participant that doesn't have some family member who is involved in the justice system or formally involved or are involved in the justice system themselves. And that means that the majority of the people that we deal with on a day-to-day basis deal with the economic barriers that David laid out earlier, that these are things that they deal with every single day as we try and get them into stable housing, get them into jobs. So a central theme of the report, the 2015 report, was focused around systems or policies that serve as key perpetrators of breaking up community. And through this lens of children, adults, community, we were able to better identify the social and economic benefits that community cohesion brings to solutions, but consequently what a demographic loses when that community is broken up. And a lot of times these are not things that we can calculate in numbers. They're as simple as having a neighbor to drop your kid off at so that you can go for a job interview. It means the feeling that you get when you walk down the street on your way to church with a neighbor, and losing that affects outcomes. It affects well-being, it affects economic and social outcomes. So gentrification and displacement are probably the clearest example of this, but in the report, but we also argue in this report that the criminal justice system is a key perpetrator of breaking up community. And while there is certainly a moral imperative to address it, we're finally starting to unpack how over-incarcerating and disproportionately incarcerating Black men, women, and youth are physically changing the face of Black communities, especially here in Oregon, and it also affecting economic security. So the most recent wealth gap, just to take a different look at it than we earlier saw, showed that the median net worth of white households was roughly $142,000. That number was $11,000 for Black families, which was a 26% decrease for white families over the last 5 years, but a 43% decrease for Black families. And we know that the justice system plays a key role in this. It is one of many systems affecting earning potential. So we've got 89% of mothers and 67% of fathers who lived with their children just prior to incarceration reporting provided financial support to their families prior to incarceration. That support is no longer there. And so from the lens of a child, we know that parental incarceration widens the gap between white and Black children's housing and education outcomes. So it increases behavioral problems, homelessness. More specifically, parental incarceration doubles the risk of homelessness for Black children. And we also know that inequitable disciplining practices in schools are simultaneously hurting graduation rates, as well as creating new generations of justice-involved populations. And again, I know that we've touched upon some of these numbers earlier, but I feel we need to retouch upon them because this is a community-driven report that had us in meetings, in community dialogue processes over the last 5 years, and these are the issues that continue to come up from families, mothers, fathers, children in our groups. So in Oregon, Black youth are only 3% of the youth population, but more than 11% held in close custody. And for whites, that's 71% of the youth population and 53% in close custody. But what is the effect that this has on the community and when the family is broken up? So you lose that earning potential of absent parents. You interrupt and lose the ability to pass on generational knowledge and expectation around wealth creation. You lose a culture revolving around jobs and create a different culture around expectation. And more importantly, we lose those hiring networks. You lose the opportunity for role models to emerge within that norm. We already know education outcomes suffer. And another thing that the report focused on, especially through our case studies, was what happens to cultural identity and overall well-being when you know that you have a 1 in 3 chance of being incarcerated at some point in your lifetime. That affects how you do in school. It affects your ability to think that you have the ability to have a job later on in life. These things are real. There's now quite a bit of research around expectations within the classroom, and I think we need more research around what incarceration does to the education outcomes of our youth. And you lose the feeling of neighborhood safety and vitality when you know that poor profiling practices are going to put you or your child at risk. So we really feel, especially through the report, that solutions need to be crafted not only around economic vitality, but also around community well-being. So we need solutions that do eliminate mandatory minimum sentences for low-level offenses, that do affect disproportionate discipline practices in school, because we are creating the new generation of incarcerated people. But we also need additional education and mentoring resources for children of incarcerated parents. We need to prioritize living wage jobs and economic security as a core component of all reentry programs. And those last two pieces are two pieces that we feel often can get left out of the conversation, but are critical components of a holistic approach to justice policy. So I will stop there for now and pass it back to you, JoAnn.
Thank you so much, Katie. Appreciate it. And so, as I promised, your secret speaker tonight will be me. I am JoAnn Hardesty. So one of the other hats that I wear is part of the steering committee for the Albina Ministerial Alliance Coalition for Justice and Police Reform. Joyce Harris, unfortunately, was ill tonight and couldn't make the panel, but I think I would be a good stand-in since, unfortunately, I attend way too many meetings having to do with police accountability in the city of Portland. I will start because I'm not sure where everybody's knowledge is about the Department of Justice settlement agreement. In December 2011, the AMA Coalition invited the Department of Justice to come to Portland to look at what was happening with black boys and men as it related to the Portland Police Bureau. At that time in 2010, we had 4 African American men who were shot, and 3 of them were killed by Portland police in that year. The Department of Justice decided, yes, they would come in and do an investigation, but somewhere between DC and Portland, they changed the focus of the investigation. So rather than coming to Portland to find out what was happening with black boys and men, they decided to come and find out what was happening with people with mental health issues or people perceived to have mental health issues. So having said that, and that's what they investigated, what they found was that Portland police, in fact, did use excessive force in their interactions with people with mental health issues and people who were perceived to have mental health issues. And so there was a year of community meetings to provide input into the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. And then there were behind closed door negotiations with the mayor's office and the DOJ that came up with a settlement agreement. Now, the settlement agreement, let me just say off the top, if you have been found guilty of violating the civil rights of people that you are sworn to protect and serve, you would think you would be the last people that you would put in charge of actually being first responders for people with mental health issues. But for whatever reason, the Department of Justice decided that Portland Police Bureau should create a behavioral health unit and train their officers to be first responders for people with mental health issues or perceived to have mental health issues. Now, we spent 2 years with the city of Portland doing all kind of maneuvers to try to not allow Judge Simon, who's the federal judge who has oversight of the settlement agreement. The city spent almost 2 years filing appeals to not have him do annual updates on whether or not we were having progress in reforming Portland Police Bureau. And so I guess good news, bad news. The good news is that the Community Oversight Advisory Board is in place. The Community Oversight Community Liaison is a position that was hired. There was an option of hiring a Portland consultant. There was an option of hiring a Salem consultant. And then there was this group from Chicago. So the community said the Portland or Salem group, either one would be fine, no big deal. And of course, the Portland City Council hired the Chicago team to come and provide oversight of Portland Police. And so, you know, I have strong feelings about that, but I'll keep it to myself for the moment. But so we have the Chicago team that flies in, and we an additional $75,000 budget so we can feed them and put them in hotels while they're here analyzing whether or not Portland Police are actually reforming the police bureau. Now, over the last 2 years, 3 years, under the last police chief, Mike Reese, we kept seeing a color-coded PowerPoint presentation where his response was 85% of the changes have been done. And he would go to city council meetings and to the federal judge and wave this report around. And so not until recently has the Department of Justice been able to go into the Portland Police Bureau and do their own analysis as to whether or not reforms are really taking place. And we also have the second report from the Chicago consulting team about what reforms they're seeing. The DOJ has pointed out several things that the community has from the beginning thought how ludicrous that the DOJ thought this made sense. So I'll give you an example. There's a EIS, an early information system, that is supposed to warn supervisors when Portland police officers are using too much force in their interaction with community members. And so it's supposed to be an early warning system to let them know they need to have conversations, they may need to do some retraining, et cetera, et cetera. Out of the 217 times that the early warning system was triggered, only 3 of those cases were ever sent to a supervisor to do any kind of oversight and analysis about whether or not the force that was used was the appropriate level at the appropriate time. The DOJ and the Community Oversight Community Liaison agree unanimously with the community and every other high-paid consultant we've ever paid that the 48-hour rule that Portland Police Bureau operates under is not supported by best practices or any kind of analysis nationally about how police officers operate with integrity and above the board. And so everybody has requested that they do away with this 48-hour rule, because if you or I were arrested, we don't get 48 hours to go talk to our union rep and get our mind straight before we have to tell an official story. Several things were really paramount in the latest DOJ and Community Oversight Community Liaison report. One is there's a requirement now that if police officers are in the vicinity and they see a police officer using excessive force, they are required to fill out an action report that evening before they retire from their shift. The DOJ has found that that is simply not happening, and so that system must be put in place. The EIS system I spoke about, it's kind of hysterical because the community had been promised this oversight system for over a decade, and it wasn't until the Department of Justice showed up that they convinced the DOJ that it was operational, it was working, and it was going to be able to hold police accountable. In addition, there were many advisory committees that were put together under the previous police chief that have required constitutionally mandated responsibility for developing policy and training recommendations, and none of those bodies that former Chief Reese put in place actually feel that they have the authority to recommend any policy changes or any training recommendations. Let me tell you how, insidious the problem is. The reality is that when asked, the Training Bureau said that they could identify no additional training needs that came out of the Department of Justice settlement agreement. So if you think about that, if you've got an entire police force that you have to train in how to better respond to people with mental health issues, but your internal mechanism that is supposedly responsible for doing the analysis says, no, we're good, we don't need any training this year, we're okay. That's a problem. And so what needs to happen, and so what's going to happen soon, on October 21st, we will do our first report back to Judge Michael Simon at the federal courthouse and the AMA Coalition, because we are unique around the country in that we're the only community-based organization that has standing in the federal court, because we told the federal judge that the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division did not represent us, because what we asked them to come to do, they didn't actually do. So the judge agreed and gave us modified standing in the federal court. And so we will be in the federal court on the 21st of October at 2 p.m. The Community Oversight Advisory Board will have a community member speaking on their behalf. The City of Portland will have their attorneys at the courthouse. And of course, the police union will also have their attorneys at the courthouse. What we know about Judge Simon is he's always been very receptive to the public voice. So we're hopeful that if the public shows up, that Judge Simon will create a space for the public to participate. But it's really, really, really important that community members, just regular community members, follow the work of the Community Oversight Advisory Board, because that really is the community voice that's looking at whether or not reforms are really taking place within the police bureau. And I can tell you that we are burning out community members at a rapid pace. If you think about the number of meetings that they have to attend, it's as if they have a full-time job with no compensation to participate in these meetings. And so if you think about, we're paying these Chicago consultants $250,000 a year to provide oversight, but community members who are volunteering their time, we don't provide them any stipends, no transportation, no childcare, no food expenses, nothing. And so if we continue down this path, we have already lost 3 community volunteers, and if we continue down this path, we're going to lose the rest of the community members. Now, the police will be there because guess what? They get paid to be there. The city will be there because guess what? They get paid to be there. But the community members, who really are the heart and soul of the reform effort, are dropping out because they just can't sustain this workload. And so 21st is the court. The 22nd will be the community meeting where you will have the opportunity to provide input on the report that was created by the Community Oversight Community Liaison. That meeting will take place on the 22nd, starting at 5:30 p.m. at PCC Cascade at Moratory Auditorium. And I will stop there. And please join me in thanking the entire panel for their presentation. It's always good when you invite someone who wears a lot of hats, because you could do just about anything in the time allotted, right? And so now I am going to go to the huge list of questions that I have acquired, and we're going to do this until about 8:27, and then we will finish up our recorded portion but continue with questions and answers. And so I didn't ask people to put their names on the question. I have 6 brains that have been provided by the Partnership for Safety and Justice. And so if your question is read, if you'd like to put your hand up, I will throw you a brain that you can take home with you. We're not making any judgment calls on this. I don't know what the brain's about, but I bet Andy will tell us. Okay, so to the first question. We have recently seen more media attention around issues of mass incarceration. Most of these efforts focus on nonviolent offenders. What are your opinions about this? Can we make real change while focusing only on these types of offenders? I know David Rogers loves this question.
Actually, I do have an answer for this question. We're not going to make that much progress, actually, if we're only focusing on nonviolent offenses. And to give you an example, one of the most impressive, actually, state reforms in the criminal justice policy world in the past several years happened actually last year in California. It was a ballot measure, Prop 47, and it essentially took a bunch of felonies, nonviolent felonies, and reclassified them, defelonized them so that they're misdemeanors, to be able to then, many of them were drug related, and then it had a built-in kind of justice reinvestment component, so to capture some of the savings from reduced spending on incarceration, and then to reinvest it in both education and drug treatment, and also victim services. So it's a great idea, and will impact tens of thousands of people. But the thing about it is, when you look at then the impact on California's prison population, because this is like one of the biggest reforms that's happened in a while, what we see is that essentially there's only 10% of folks in the California state prison system left that have no conviction that could be classified as violent in nature. So you have one of the it is actually, I guess, the country's largest prison system. It's continuing to grow, and they're not going to be able to do a damn thing about it unless they pass sentencing reforms that address more serious crimes. And so I would just say add this, which is I talked a lot about the trend of mass criminalization, and part of that has actually been driven by what I would describe as the punishment paradigm. You know, we have a culture that's obsessed with essentially like dropping the hammer on people, you know, and we need to start to separate out holding people accountable for something, which, you know, I'm a big believer. I value accountability. We need to hold people accountable, and not just for like criminal acts, but just for like, you know, doing harm. So, but we need to separate out accountability from like harsh mandatory minimums and sentences. That those two things are very different, and yet we've thought about them as synonymous. And until we start actually changing the culture of the punishment paradigm, we're not going to get very far. I hope that made sense.
It does. Anybody else want to weigh in? Andy? Katie?
No, we'll go on to the next question.
All right. Katie, you good? Yes. Okay, next question. Please talk about the role prosecutors play in the disparities in Oregon's criminal justice system.
I'm definitely going to have something to say about that, but I'll give my colleagues an opportunity.
Well, I will start with that one and just simply say, if we're ever going to hold police accountable, the only way to do that will be for district attorneys to actually indict police officers for unconstitutional behavior. And until we are in a city where that happens, we will never, ever indict a police officer for harming or killing a community member.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. You know, DAs are elected. I think and David and I and others have talked about this quite a bit, actually. Until you actually have real elections for them, and there's some sort of competition and some accountability in terms of airing what's gone on during the administration of a particular, you know, whoever the DA happens to be. Until you start doing that, and here we're sitting here with the League of Women Voters, right? Until you start airing some of that stuff and actually supporting some contenders, you know, some people who are challenging the sitting DA. I was looking at a chart recently, and I think like more than half, maybe 2/3 of the races are unopposed. How do you have something that is such an important position that is supposed to be democratically elected, have just one candidate, and 2/3 of them across the state, half to 2/3 running unopposed? It's insane. And then when you take Measure 11, right, where you have the mandatory minimums set up by Measure 11, and there were a whole bunch of other little statistics that I didn't mention, some of them being that, you know, the conviction rate on charged Measure 11, a lot of times, you know, they're pled down to non-Measure 11 cases. So, I mean, it's used as to twist the arm of a defendant to plead to a lesser crime, so they don't actually have to prosecute them. And so these are all decisions made by the DA. It's been taken out of the judge's hands. It's been taken out of the jury's hands. They're told, you know, make this finding and convict this person, and then they go away. Or else they basically coerce them into pleading. So the DAs are incredibly important, but there has to be a race involved.
Yes, and if you think that that's not true, remember Mike Schrunk was district attorney here in Multnomah County for 32 years, and when he retired, his hand-picked replacement was the only name on the ballot for our election. So what you say is absolutely true. Anybody else want to comment?
Yeah, yeah. This is a really very severe problem, the lack of district attorney accountability and the lack of actually contested elections. The district attorneys are the most powerful people in the criminal justice system. And we will not see change until we see change in terms of a movement from district attorneys who are primarily focused on a tough on crime mentality to really focusing more like on a smart on crime mentality. So like, what are we doing to prevent and not just they're measuring their success on usually with one measure. How many convictions have I made? And you know what? How many convictions have I made is absolutely no measure for the effectiveness of someone who really isn't charged with helping to create public safety. I want to know like what they're doing to invest in prevention. I want to know what they're doing to get more people into treatment rather than jail. I want to know what they're doing to actually charge less youth as adults and actually keeping young people in the juvenile justice system. There are very different measures for success, but district attorneys aren't using them. And frankly, we have a lot of blame, all of us in the room as well, because we're not holding DAs accountable. To Andy's point, right? Like, voters to the large degree, although I should be a little bit easier on all of us in the room. I mean, the fact that we're here is indicative of the fact that we care and we're paying attention. But district attorney races, for the most part, are the majority of voters aren't paying attention. And so when we look at the most powerful people in the criminal justice system, when we look at in the US over the past 20 years, crime has been going down, but the number of people that district attorneys are charging with felonies has been going up. So we need to shift their engagement. And one other thing which is actually kind of repeating Andy's point, but this is an area of our democracy that has absolutely atrophied. Like we're not engaged. Like people are oftentimes calling their legislators when they're either upset that their state legislator isn't doing a damn thing about an issue that people care about, or they're emailing their legislators because to thank them for their support. But yet, the most powerful person in terms of impacting our criminal justice system, who are elected leaders, how often are they fielding those calls? How often are we emailing them and holding them accountable and saying to Rod Underhill, the Multnomah County District Attorney, why are you charging so many youth as adults? What about the juvenile justice system don't you believe in? Because you know what? It's actually worked pretty well to be able to recognize that like young people need to be treated differently if we're going to protect their future. So we need to be having a very different conversation with district attorneys if we're going to make any sort of movement. Oh, and one last thing, and on that note, because I'm a guest of the League of Women Voters, I want to say that I actually think I would love to work with the League on this issue, because I think that the League of Women Voters is a historic, credible, trusted organization that engages around elections. And I would love to work with you to build a plan to influence your candidate questionnaires, your candidate forums, so that we're infusing, we're actually asking district attorneys who might actually be in a contested race to begin to answer questions of the questions that the League is posing, to be able to find out really what they stand for, because I think that we need to get them to recognize that the public wants a different measure of effectiveness that's not about we're putting more people in prison.
Thank you. I think I'm going to go to Katie on that end. We'll let the fire cool off on this end for a while. Any comment on the recent publicity about conservatives, libertarians' interest in criminal justice reform, including financial support by the Koch brothers? Is this just lip service, or is there genuine bipartisan interest in meaningful reform?
Am I supposed to respond to that?
Yeah.
You're looking at me. I will not respond to that directly. I'm sure my colleagues have some opinion on it. But I will say that having worked in, I was working in the criminal justice policy field in New York for many years, and the recent attention by the conservative side to start to acknowledge how much money we're spending and realize that that's not where we want to be spending our dollars, our tax dollars. I appreciate that voice is coming to the table. I think we have an opportunity, but I think that's only half of the conversation. The rest is around what we're criminalizing, and yeah, I think for me, especially around this most recent report, our focus really, in addition to dealing with adults, but our focus really we want to have it be around the juvenile justice population, and starting to look at what's happening in schools. Not starting to look at what's happening in schools, but looking at the way that kids are being disciplined in very, very different ways. I mean, 20% of Black middle school students are suspended at one point in middle school, and you know, the moment you're suspended, your likelihood of graduation, your graduation rate goes down to 40%. I think it's really important that we start to focus on what's happening in the schools because that's the feeder of the future adult system. That does not answer that question, but.
No, it doesn't, but I appreciate what you said, and to follow up on what you said, I think one of our biggest challenges and something we need to rethink is when we start putting armed police officers into our public education system. I mean, right now, when anything that happens inside a school building becomes criminal act because you have police officers inside the building. And I think we have to rethink that. There's really no good reason to have police inside a place that's supposedly about education, about learning, about being able to make mistakes. And you should be able to make mistakes outside of the glaring eyes of the police. And so I just think that we're going really, really backwards with that. But as in regard to the Koch brothers, I mean, you know, I always find it interesting when conservatives and libertarians all of a sudden are standing up for racial justice. I don't think that they have done the racial justice analysis yet. I think it's really more about their bottom line. And so if they're finding that they're no longer going to be able to make the bucket load of money that they've been able to make from the criminal justice system, then they're going to try to do something different. And a great example is here, now that marijuana is legal, I don't see anybody jumping up and down saying, what are we going to do about all those Black and brown people who we've convicted over the last 20 years on marijuana convictions who now have no ability to get jobs, housing, education. Nobody's talking about how we're going to make that right at the same time that we know white men are standing in the doorway getting ready to become millionaires on legal marijuana. And so I think that's a problem.
Can I say something about that? So one of the things that was on that sheet, before I got here, I was at the Open Society Foundations, and some of you may know that's George Soros's foundation. So he's like the anti-Koch brother.
Yes.
He's the and then there's the Koch brothers, way off on the right side. And I have to say, I mean, there's Mark Levin, who is from Texas. He's sort of a conservative intellectual, and then he sort of was the founder of the Right on Crime movement and kind of led that, and you know, this is Newt Gingrich and all that crowd. I actually have to say, and I think they're sincere about caring about this. I think the thing that we have to accept and also be careful about in accepting that sincerity is that they may not be doing it for the same reasons that we are. Their motivations may be different. Their motivations may not be bad necessarily, but their motivations could potentially lead us down a road that would have, at least as far as we're concerned, unintended consequences and not solve the problems that maybe this crowd cares about. And so, you know, everything's kind of tentative. You've got the ACLU and the Koch brothers and the Coalition for Public Safety. This is one of the ones that's sort of emerging. It's the kind of classic one where the Center for American Progress is involved in that. You know, all these very liberal organizations, all these very conservative organizations. And they're starting to think about and they're kind of learning from each other, and I think that's actually to the good. I think actually there being a dialogue there and actually a little bit of cross-pollination. One of the things we didn't get to in this conversation, and maybe we'll try to weave it in a little bit, is the solutions section. There were a few things that David and I had to talk about in terms of solutions. PSJ, under his leadership, and now mine, it is a very solutions-oriented organization. And I think that this is a step towards that. Last thing I'll say about this, libertarians were always against the war on drugs, strongly against the war on drugs. Not necessarily for a racial justice, but some of them actually do have a racial justice analysis, but they've always been against the war on drugs. So cut them that much.
Thank you. Did you want to weigh in, David?
I guess I would say that I think the reason why there's been a significant growth of Republican leadership on this issue that really started about 15 years ago when you had a large number of Republican governors who were battling significant state budget crises, and they recognized that the most significant problem driving the state budget crisis was the growth of the corrections budget. And so when you had a large number of Republican governors dealing with that problem, that's when we began to see more significant Republican leadership kind of beginning to get nurtured and cultivated. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I would completely agree that the motivations are different. And to JoAnn's point, like, the focus on race, institutional racism, racial disparity really isn't there.
Well, I think we are going to start talking about solutions, and then I'll come back to the questions if we have more time, because I think, I know our listening audience wants to know, what are the solutions? So we've laid out some really complex problems. Where do we start, I guess is the question. Where do we start fixing this, undoing what we've done? And Katie, how about I start with you, and we'll just come on up.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'll just reiterate the focus on addressing disproportionate discipline in schools. I think that's something we need to do right away. But the other thing, one of the best solutions to reducing recidivism and changing the incarcerated population is also around jobs. And one of the things we're doing around the state is something called the Ban the Box campaign. I don't know if people have heard of it. We successfully passed legislation that took the box asking about criminal history off of the job application on a state level. But we're working on that on a citywide ordinance that's much stronger. And for some of it's a stronger ordinance because it doesn't have, currently you can ask about criminal history, you can engage in a conversation around criminal history within a job interview, and we already know that significantly decreases your likelihood of getting a job. So what this ordinance does is not allow criminal history to be asked about until after a conditional offer has been made. And I think that's important because to this conversation in particular, because it's about shifting the conversation towards second chances and fair chances for all. And that's one of the reasons why we're trying to pass this citywide ordinance. It is, and I also bring it up because we need people and we need support. And we're looking to pass it in November. So we'll definitely be seeking your support in that. But in the meantime,
is it coming to the city council in November?
If I hope everyone's listening, we hope it will be coming to the city council. We're waiting on a date. And in the meantime, calling the mayor, calling city commissioners, and letting them know that we want to see the Ban the Box ordinance passed. We want to see it passed as soon as possible, is something that everyone can do tonight or tomorrow during office hours.
Thank you. Andy?
Solutions. Well, let me start. I'm just trying to think which one to start with here. I think I'm going to start with the family sensing alternative. So I'm going to get really sort of nitty gritty and concrete. So in the past legislature, this 2015 state legislature, Jennifer Williamson, now the House Majority Leader, sponsored a bill with Andy Olson, a Republican, in the House, and this is House Bill 3503, if anyone cares to look it up, to create a sentencing alternative for parenting people who are parents, custodial parents at the time of their arrest who have been sentenced to prison. And the idea here, and it came out of Washington. Washington State actually was the first state to do it. I think we're the second state to do it, to keep children and their parents together after their parents have been convicted of a crime that could lead to imprisonment. And so the idea is that these families would get services to keep them together. The goal of it is supposed to be, although, bureaucracies morph things into different ways, and that's one of the things that we have to make sure that we stay vigilant about, to make sure that the purpose of us and the services are to actually keep the children together. And from PSJ's point of view, we've been talking a lot about harm reduction, right? It's a small step. It's a pilot project in 5 counties. It's limited to nonviolent offenses. Sex offenses are also excluded if you want to break those out. But it's a mind shift, right? It's what we're really shooting for in a lot of the things that we propose as solutions is a different way of doing things, something that has come from a different point of view that can be implemented and then normalized. And so what was interesting about this is the impact. Let me just mention that very quickly. So we have 14,500 roughly people in the prison system in Oregon. 63% of the men, and the men are the vast majority of that population, 63% are fathers. Of the women, about 81% are mothers. And so that the estimation is that there's 20,000 children with parents in prison right now. Pretty large impact. But what was fascinating about this, along with it just being a good idea and something that we ought to expand, that concept we should expand to other populations that are facing prison, in my mind, is that the sponsors of it, 26 were Democrats, 29 were Republicans. And when it was voted on in the House and the Senate, 85 of the 90 legislators who voted, well, actually the 90 legislators, 85 voted yes, 2 voted no, and 3 were excused. There was massive support for this idea. So that there's a little light bulb that goes off, right? It's like you have to find the things that are of concern to people across the board. Everyone cares about family. They don't want children growing up without their parents. They don't want children to have to face foster care. So it's the kind of thing that we have to be thinking about in those terms. We have to actually find some commonality in order to find effective solutions.
So I'm curious, Andy, is that program different than the Family Preservation Project that they cut at the Department of Corrections this year?
Yes, so that was within the prison. So this didn't actually prevent people from going to prison. That was the point of that, was to preserve families. Still, a great idea, to preserve families and make sure that, because one of the things I actually didn't read this off before is that a huge percentage of the parents, when they're incarcerated, either have very little contact with their children or no contact at all. So, they may be incarcerated for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and some of them never have a single contact with their children. Many, I don't, but most, I'm not even going to pull out the statistic, but many don't even have even a phone contact, no contact at all, let alone an in-person contact while they're in prison.
Thank you so much for that, Andy. This concludes the recorded part of our panel discussion this evening. I want to thank you to the panel for providing us with useful information that will help us as we continue to address and find solutions to resolving disparate treatment of African Americans and people of color in Oregon's criminal justice system. Thank you to our donors, the Multnomah Bar Foundation and the Ethel Noble Memorial Bequest, for their support for this program. And thank you to our audience and volunteers. This has been a production of Metro East Community Media and a presentation of League of Women Voters of Portland Education Fund and the Portland chapter of the Links Incorporated. The November Civic Education Program is coal and oil transport, business boon, or public liability, and will be here at the Multnomah County Boardroom at 7 p.m. Tuesday, November 10th. It will be recorded for rebroadcasting. We will continue with our solutions part of our program.